Hello again. This is supposed to be a much more casual follow-up video to my debut upload about the Monkees' touring adventures in the 60s. So, if you haven't watched it yet, or if you don't even know who the Monkees were, then I highly suggest you go watch my last video before this, because this will be a more informal rundown of instruments they used within the major live performances and tours that I discussed about in the last video. All caught up? Great. But first, I have a few things to note regarding the last video and this video. First of all, for the last video, I made the mistake of saying that costume changes became a part of the Monkees' live act in 1967. The costume changes actually began near the end of the first tour from 1966 to early 1967. I also failed to mention that some of the tours actually filmed and turned into their show's first season finale, simply titled Monkees on Tour. And secondly, about this video, I will only be talking about any instruments I can find any pictures or footage of that were used within the 60s live shows. So I will have to leave out a handful of their other instruments from the show or the albums, due to them never being used on stage in concerts within the 60s. Also, I tried looking for a particular brand or anything for Davy Jones' maracas and tambourine, but I unfortunately couldn't find anything. So there won't really be much else to report about Davy's instruments until the later half of this video. With that being said, let's start with the 1966 tour. Guess I'll have to start off with the most recognized instrument used during this tour, Mike's Blonde Gretsch, Model 6076. This guitar was a 12-string and was pretty much the only guitar used by any of the four Monkees in the 66 tour. This guitar in particular was actually made by Fred Gretsch himself as a non-production model for Mike Nesmith. Fred also made two similar guitars for Chet Atkins and George Harrison of the Beatles, and don't worry, I have something planned around the Beatles for the next video. Anyway, up next is Peter Tork with three instruments he played during this tour. His Burgundy Gretsch bass, Model 6073, his Vox Continental organ, and his Ode banjo. The Gretsch bass was only ever used live for this one tour, allegedly due to feedback issues Peter constantly had with it. Unlike most of the instruments I'm going to talk about with this video, you can actually still buy this bass at certain outlets, except now it's called the G6073 electric tone bass. The Vox Continental was a pretty famous organ or keyboard back in the 60s, and it definitely had its place with the Monkees. For a few songs, like I'm a Believer, Peter would move from bass to the organ, and Dave would have to take over for bass. There isn't much else to say about his Ode banjo, besides just using it for his solo spots for songs like Cindy or Cripple Creek. And finally, for the 66 tour, we have Mickey. He played a Gretsch Broadcaster drum kit with a champagne sparkle wrap finish. This was actually the kit Mickey learned to play on in early 1966. While learning, he learned to drum with a very unconventional setup for his kit. This is due to his childhood illness called perthus, where his right foot wasn't as strong as his left foot, so playing in the traditional style would physically pain him, hence his unique setup. He played this kit from the 66 tour to the first half of the 1967 tours in the US and the UK. And of course, the Monkees used various models of Vox amplifiers in almost all their tours. Up next is the 1967 tours. And for their 67 tours in the US and the UK, Mike actually used a few different guitars for this particular tour, with one of them being another 12-string Gretsch that's just in a sunburst finish instead. Another being a Fender 12-string electric acoustic guitar, and another being a blonde 12-string Rickenbacker, although these guitars were only ever really used to substitute for Mike's usual blonde Gretsch for about a night or two. Peter replaced two of his usual touring instruments during this tour as well. Most notably, he replaced his Gretsch bass for a Guild Jetstar bass, as well as replacing his Vox Continental organ with a Fender Rhodes bass piano. Besides these two, he still held on to his Ode banjo. And very early on in the 67 tour, Mickey replaced his Gretsch drum kit for a Black Rogers drum kit with varying components for certain nights. In 1968, the Monkees had to film a short concert in Salt Lake City for their film Head, and do two tours in Australia and Japan. By then, the Monkees had already acquired new gear. Most famously, Mike replaced any and all guitars he'd used on the stage before then with a custom white Gibson SG. Although, in only one picture, there seems to be a white Fender Stratocaster hidden behind Mickey's drum stand. But there doesn't seem to be any photos or footage out there of Mike using it though. Peter still used his Guild bass, but replaced the Fender Rhodes piano with an unidentified keyboard. I've looked around for a particular model, but I just can't seem to find any brand or model number for it. And no, I don't believe it to be the keyboard Peter used in the TV special 33 1/3 revolution per Monkee, because I've compared the one in the photo to the one in the footage, and no angles seem to match at all. And yet again, Mickey replaced his drum kit, This time he used a black Slingerland drum kit with 2 bass drums both reading drum. And finally we have the 1969 tour and the weird television appearances that went with it. Keep in mind that Peter Tork had already left the Monkees by then, so I won't be talking about him in this last segment. By then, the Monkees weren't really able to afford any new equipment anymore, save for some different Fender amps. So for the most part, they just used instruments they had already had from previous tours or studio sessions. Mike used both his custom SG and a black Gibson Les Paul, which he had since 1967. And fun fact, Mike actually used the exact same Les Paul to record the opening to Pleasant Valley Sunday. Mickey used the Slingerland drum kit again, except this time he got rid of a bass drum and went back to just having one, although he didn't drum much on his final tour anyway, since he'd mostly be up front singing. And finally, Davey used his custom red 3/4 scale Gretsch bass. There's only ever one made by Gretsch for Davey in 1966. However, he usually just used whatever bass Peter would be using on tours, but since Peter wasn't with them anymore, he finally had a proper instrument to call his own. If you've seen my last video, you'd know that the Monkees didn't really last too long after this, as they were done and gone with by late 1970, until the 1980s and then again in the late 1990s. So that was my look back at the instruments the Monkees used in their tours back in the 60s. Tune in again next time when I take a look at some knockoff records to try to cash in on another fab foursome.